All right, well, welcome everybody to today's conversation. Let's go ahead and get started. We were going to give it a couple more minutes while a few more people join, but that's all right. I think we're going to have a smaller crowd today, which I think is a good thing, so we can open up for some Q&A and answer questions you might have. Kind of last minute, spur of the moment type of webinar based off of a recent kind of study and article that we read that we thought would be super relevant to many of you. So I think my goal today is, before I get too much deeper into like what we're going to talk about and introductions of Reviewr, would love to instead just kind of set the stage a little bit of how we kind of got to this point and kind of why today is going to be a good conversation. I think a lot of it goes back to the roots of why we started the company at Reviewr. And it kind of all comes down to mission and vision and trying to impact people's lives. And I would assume many of you are kind of in the same boat. So looking at a couple of you who are here, I think, the general premise that started today's conversation was based off of a recent trend study done by, let's pull up here, by community brands. So this was heavily targeted towards membership-based associations. But as we were kind of reading through this and kind of going through some of the metrics and some of the stats, it's very relevant to grant makers, scholarship providers, those that do fellowships, really any type of organization that has volunteers or kind of key stakeholders that make up your program. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into some of the kind of topics here and kind of why we decided to have this conversation in the first place. So if I go back here to some of the summaries that I had, I think to set the stage here just a little bit. So Reviewr works with thousands and thousands of organizations, many of which are membership-based associations. That's why we're kind of on that email campaign and why we got that study. Some of the things that I want to kind of call out, I think it kind of builds a bigger trend that many of us are very aware, and we understand that maybe we are lacking technology and/or we have high key areas of focus and priority, but we might be left without the tools that we need to be successful. So to start things off with, I think one of the most interesting metrics to me was that right now, over 75% of organizations are prioritizing the participant experience over their own. So what I mean by that is, if you go back in time to kind of look at what a typical grant making process looks like, we're looking for ways to make our own lives easier, right? How do we create efficiencies and tools that help streamline our own internal operations? Less time in spreadsheets, less time in email, all that kind of fun stuff. But at the end of the day, we make up roughly 1/3 of the program. So as you kind of see here, as we kind of move into 2025, over 75% of organizations are trying to put an emphasis on how do we elevate the experience for the applicants as well as the volunteers and the review committees. While at the same time, we're trying to create, 60% of us are focusing on kind of internal efficiencies and improvements from that front. The other thing that kind of stood out to me is that this is an increasing number of organizations that are prioritizing data security and privacy. So as a grant making organization, typically that implies that there's funding involved, right? Very obviously, any type of data that we're collecting is now considered sensitive or PII. And so if we're not thinking through data security, not thinking through privacy, then we need to be. It has to be at the very forefront of our conversations. It's also very obvious that right now manual processes are not only creating like burdens on ourselves, but one thing that I found very interesting is that in that study, it has a negative portrayal of you as an organization, not you as you guys on the phone, right? But in general, having a lack of technologies and tools and efficiencies makes the organization hosting a grant look kind of negative amongst the community. So those are some of the facts. And so the reason why I think that this trend study, which I will share out, it's a pretty good read. It's quite lengthy. What we're basically saying here, though, is that we're all very aware of some of these metrics, right? We want to be more efficient. We want to build a better experience for our participants. We want to kind of focus on data security and privacy. But then the question that kind of gets arise from this is like, why aren't we? And so I think the general theme here is we have a lack of understanding of what tools are available to us, or B, what the negative impact of not using these tools looks like. So we definitely use ChatGPT and we Google like, what does an efficient grant or a scholarship look like? And it kind of came out as this, right? So I think we can all agree that this is not what a modern, efficient, and engaging process looks like. So if you go back to this study, I basically summarized by saying that most organizations surveyed feel that current use of technology is either average, lacking, or not modern. Most organizations' tech stacks consist of, and this would be kind of generally speaking towards grant making, a combination of emails, spreadsheets, downloading of document, Google Drive, built-in databases, web forms, etc. Very few organizations, sub 30%, are actually using a dedicated grant management or application software tool like Reviewr. So then the question comes up, well, if we want to maybe focus our time on the applicant experience, we want to create efficiencies, why aren't we using these tools, especially when we're so focused on operation speaking, when your applicants and your judges make up 2/3 of the program? So that kind of then comes back full circle to why we built Reviewr. So we actually lived a life in your shoes. We were part of the review volunteer committees for different types of funding opportunities. So back in 2012, if you think through what a grant process will look like, we literally would have hundreds and hundreds of binders and physical pieces of mail mailed to our doorsteps. We were asked with reviewing them, providing insights, providing feedback and comments to justify who the grant recipients would be. We then kind of lived that online transitionary period where it was a combination of built-in web forms, emails, downloading of documents. And we saw kind of two really terrible things happen. First and foremost is from an applicant or submission perspective. When you started to see these applications come in via email with a bunch of attachments, when you started to see these kind of like manual processes, either A, information was being lost, or B, you started to see things go to spam. So we actually had seen teams sit down, go through entire judging and selection processes. They cut checks, they awarded funds, and then found out months and months later that there were a handful of qualified applicants that didn't even get included in the review, right? So as a mission-driven organization, like that just physically can't happen. The other thing that we started to see was from a review and selection perspective, other volunteers and board members making very clear biases in their selections, either based off of personal identifying information about the applicant, based off of who they knew, right? They might have been close friends and family. They might be board members or stakeholders in that organization. And so they had, obviously they were cutting checks to maybe not the most qualified candidates just because of personal biases. So these were the experiences that led us to build Reviewr. Over the last decade, we've had tremendous success changing the lives of many, many organizations and people. And then to see a study like this come across the plate where it basically calls out, we realize that these are important, yet we're not doing anything about it, is what led us to kind of host this kind of spur of the moment webinar to kind of unpack a bit more about like what does life look like on the other end? Like what is like the grass is always greener on the other end? Like it really is greener. And so what I wanted to do today is kind of take what this process for many of you may look like. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, where typical grant making is a combination of 6 or 7 different tools based on some of our research that we've done. And how do we consolidate that into one centralized hub? Like what are the many benefits it's going to have, not just for you and your organization, but also, quite frankly, more importantly, the other 2/3 of your program, your applicants, your volunteers, your board members, your stakeholders, and everybody involved. How do we focus on elevating the applicant's experience? How do we, of course, create operational efficiencies for you guys? I'm a parent of 2. I don't want to be working on Wednesday nights at 9, 10 o'clock in spreadsheets, right? I want to be focusing on my friends and my family, yet we're kind of left without tools to make our own lives easier. And then third and last and foremost, probably the most important, is how do we ensure that as we cut checks and award these grants, that we're done so in a very fair, non-biased, and compliant manner. So I use the term experience quite a bit, and that's actually where we're going to start today. I think that in order for us to run a very successful grant making program, we have to consider these types of programs as experiences. And so from a submitter or from an applicant's perspective, it's absolutely vital that we elevate their experience by lowering the barrier. Again, many of you are going to be offering different types of grants for different types of reasons, but at the end of the day, these are life-changing opportunities without a doubt, and we have to treat them as such. We want to create this ecosystem where an applicant can come in, they can feel confident, they can feel trusted. They want to know that when they submit their personal identifying information and these kind of life-changing stories, that their information is going to be safe. It's not going to be lost. It's not going to be sold. It's not going to be hacked. They want to make sure that when they're filling out these submissions, they can allocate their time to creating the best version of their self and their story, and less so concerned about, downloading fillable forms and recompiling spreadsheets and sending you guys emails. They want to kind of enter a very modern online experience, fill out their information. They want to be able to save. They want to log out. They want to come back later. They want to receive reminder messages because people inevitably will always procrastinate. Yes, that's on them. That's their fault, but we can still do things to kind of help create a better ecosystem for them. On top of that, and this is kind of just a little bit of a side tangent, is I talked to an organization the other day, and they said that they use a platform like Reviewr for their grant making program for 95% of it. However, once they cut checks and did their grant, they actually wanted the grantees to come back and submit some additional deliverables like grant reporting templates 6 months later. And so they used a tool, but then they had all those grant reporting templates, which included, personal identifying information, tax ID numbers, tax returns, and they were sending that to them through email. So they literally use a tool like Reviewr for 95% of the program, but then that last 5%, which is highly confidential, they used email. And so how do you create kind of this full life cycle where the applicants can not only submit online, but they can also receive feedback, receive communication, they can re-enter the portal, they can update their records, they can submit their grant reporting templates, and they can kind of stay in one centralized hub. And then the last element here will be references. So I'm going to toss a quick note here in the chat. Are anyone collecting references? Give me kind of a quick emoji thumbs up, thumbs down reaction if that's something that you do. It's absolutely an emerging trend that we've started to see. It's also one that's causing quite a bit of problems because now you're having information coming in from an external user, and a lot of times they're not tied into a platform like Reviewr. And so now, as an operation team member, you have all these grant applications coming in, but then you have all these other references that are getting sent to you either physically in the mail, they're coming in through email, and you're kind of left wondering, what do I do with it? So if that is something that you do, I will spend a bit more time talking about it. If not, we'll just kind of skip through that. But with all that said, I do want to kind of visualize like what does a very modern and engaging submission experience look like. So let's jump into Reviewr and we're going to kind of run through a high level example. My goal here today is not necessarily to show you all the ins and outs of Reviewr. It's not intended to be a demo. It's more so, look, based off of the studies, and I'm not just making these up, I literally have it pulled up right here. We have some data that says on a general grant making program, most organizations, sub 30, 40% are not using tools like Reviewr. So what are you kind of missing out on? So from an applicant perspective, the in general concept here starts with a concept called profiles. No matter what tools or processes you have in place, everything has to start here. Why is that? There are so many moving parts to a grant making process. You've got people, submissions, file uploads, ongoing data collection needs from the grantees, communication, judging and selection processes. For many of you, it might be a multi-phase or multi-round type of review. You physically can't have these processes start somewhere and then end up somewhere else. The entire end-to-end life cycle has to start in the same place. It has to build up over time and hold into all of the activities that pertain to the applicant and to the grant making process. So in Reviewr, it's quite simple. Applicants come in, they just tell us who they are. This in its core allows them to save, they can log out, they can come back later. Again, there's a save and log out functionality. For many of our clients, they actually have either multiple grants and or some other grants have highly specific criteria. So these are, again, it's a bunch of small things that incrementally add up to build a better experience for the applicants. And so in that use case, you don't want people to apply for one of your programs that just quite frankly aren't eligible. You're wasting their time and they're wasting yours. At the same time, we have some of our clients that, again, have multiple grant opportunities, many of which either go underfunded or they have really highly qualified applicants that don't even know that it's an opportunity for them. So they use a series of questions. I call it like an eligibility screener. And they basically answer a series of questions. This is at a high level an example. I've seen really complex ones. I've seen really simple ones. And the system would basically say, hey, based on what you just put into the system, either yes, you can proceed on, so that way you're not wasting people's time if they're not eligible. Or if you are offering multiple grants like this example, the system would actually say, hey, based on your information, these are the 3 opportunities that you best align with. Which of or all of them do you want to apply for? So now we're actually tying in a really complex process where you have a centralized hub where all applicants go. And then based on this process, it'll start to kind of push them down the different workflows that are most relevant to them. So if I choose the Lennox Wilder grant, I can actually be displayed completely different forms, different judging criteria, totally different workflows than if I chose the Bobby Gatsby grant. Yet from a marketing perspective, everybody enters in the same centralized hub. So kind of moving on, I do think that this is a really well-structured grant application process. It's targeted towards organizations applying for funding, but a lot of this can be relevant to applicants as well for a self-funded grant. But the reason why I like this is at some point in time, we're going to have to talk about grant reporting, either internally for yourselves, right? How do you show impact to your stakeholders? But also from an applicant's perspective, if they're going to ask for funding, they have to be able to come back to us and say, hey, not only did I do what I said I would do with it, but here's the impact that I had. And it's very hard to build that case and do grant reporting if you don't have the proper data collected on the front end. So I'll kind of walk you through what that would look like. Again, the whole idea here is that we're not using built-in spreadsheets. We're not doing fillable Word documents or forms. We're not having people download content and send it to you via email. This is a dedicated grant portal that they're interacting with. So applicants come in, they tell us about who they are. We are going to collect some maybe tax ID information. Tell us more about how much money you're requesting. And then really the bulk of this form, it's quite simple in a good way. It's basically going to say, what do you need this money for? What are you going to do with it? And then the core component to there is how are you going to measure impact? So in this example, I'm requesting $1 million grant. Here's my grant title. Let's go back a page here. Tell us more about a summary of it. Tell us more of the details. How does it align with your mission and your vision? We're going to come back to file uploads, but I do have a budget. So that's a spreadsheet that was uploaded. Why is this a necessary project to fund? tell us more about how the funds are going to be utilized. And then again, what I like is both tell us more about how you're going to define success. We will come back to that. We're literally asking the grantee, hey, if we cut you a check for XYZ, how are you going to be able to measure success? Because we actually are going to ask you those exact same questions in 6 months or 1 year from now. And so now we're basically building you as a grantee a template to work off of to report back your own impact. We also want to know the sustainability of the project. Again, this is, somewhat of a unique grant application for organizations, but what are the odds of you needing follow-up funds, et cetera. So we're basically building kind of this narrative around the grantee that's a combination of open-ended text as well as file uploads like budgets. As I progress on, we also get into some additional files, so project plans and financial statements. So this goes back to the concept of a profile and how I can honestly call this a very modern and engaging grant application. Because again, historically speaking, not only do you now have a person, but you have their form and then you have all these file uploads. And so in a traditional environment, how are you going to take their application, take their file uploads, merge them all together? It's very likely that you want to redact data or PII from your review team's perspective to ensure a fair, non-biased review. How are you doing things like that? And so that's all kind of baked into these processes and baked into these workflows. As far as the reference goes, I know one of you answered that question, so I'll talk at a very high level how this works. But it's an emerging trend that we've seen in the grant making space, where you want an external individual to offer their insights and feedback about a particular candidate to help build their narrative and build their story. At this point in time, everybody is great at writing grants, right? They have great budgets. There's a lot of strong projects that are being submitted. So how do you, as a grant making organization, sit down and make a quality selection when everybody is great? So the idea behind a reference, and historically speaking, what happens is you have these individuals that will send to you probably an email and saying, hey, I'm Kyle. Here's why I think so-and-so should receive this grant. The challenge that you now need to download that information, recompile it, figure out who it belongs to, and then merge it together. The other challenge that you run into is the entire idea behind a reference is to create this ecosystem where you're building a narrative around the most deserving applicants. However, most references are letters, and it's a reflection of the writing ability of the reference and not who they're writing it about. So the challenge that comes into play is you might not even be awarding the most deserving people just because they have a really poor reference that wrote about them. So the idea here is that the applicant puts in like the name and email of the reference. It'll actually then trigger an email notification to the reference, letting them know that they were asked. And then what they'll end up doing is that they will fill out the form online. No longer do we want to see reference letters. Instead, what's going to happen is it's going to ask the reference to answer a series of questions. Right? So we're elevating their experience as well. They come into a centralized hub, they answer a series of questions, they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. And then as soon as they submit it, and I'm going to show this to you, it gets automatically attached back to the applicant's profile, which then means that when you go to do a review, you're not comparing apples to oranges. Every single applicant has the same data associated with them. It also creates kind of an ecosystem where you can send out reminder messages to both the applicants and the references as well. So because not many people noted that they're doing references, I'll just stop there, but I can always circle back on that towards the end of the conversation. But when I say like it's all about elevating the applicant's experience, I think we have to broadly make the assumption that applicants aren't sole individuals. It might be a team of people working on a project together. It might be applicants plus references, or a whole lot of other people that are involved in these processes. So kind of then going back to the next piece of that, I talked about how this organization I talked to last week that used a platform to collect applications. They went through the entire review and selection process. And then using this example, they basically said, hey, Michael, we're going to fund you for XYZ dollars. The next step is to, in 6 months from now, submit your grant reporting template. And now Michael is literally filling out a fillable PDF as a template, saving to his local hard drive, and then emailing it or physically mailing it back into the grant maker. So in this ecosystem, again, it's all about elevating the experience. Applicants come back to their own profile. They can receive communication directly from you. And then Michael, in this case, will jump up top to the top of their page. I'm going to come back to some of this here in just a minute. And they would then select add new, and they're going to pick from a list what they're trying to add. So in this example, Michael's going to say, hey, I want to add a grant reporting template. Michael will then literally fill out that grant reporting template right in Reviewr. Now, again, this corresponds and maps directly back to the grant application. So again, we have them reiterating their initial goals, the actual outcomes, and then any discrepancies between it. We asked them earlier on, hey, if we give you a grant, how are you going to measure impact? So now we're going to ask you, how did you actually measure impact based off of your very own set of metrics? What was the quantitative and qualitative impact you had? Tell us more about the actual breakdown of funds, right? The original budget was for 1 million. How much did you actually end up spending? What were some of the discrepancies between that? Tell us more about lessons learned. And if you are, requesting some additional funds or budgets, to upload that and add it here. So this is critical because as soon as this gets submitted, it actually gets added back to the applicant's profile. So if I go back and view Michael, the scholarship or the grantee, I can see there's an actual line item on his profile called like January or fall grant reporting template. And then all the data that was just submitted is now in real time and automatically recompiled back to his profile. So when your team goes to generate grant impact reports or grant reporting templates for your own boards and for your own teams, I have data that's in a very consolidated manner. I can say, okay, here's a breakdown of all my applicants. Here's the type of funding that they requested it. Here's what we actually funded, and here's what we actually did. And by the way, here's how those funds were utilized and the impact that we were able to have. And it's all done in real time automatically based on this process. So I'll kind of pause there and go back over to some of these bullet points. But again, I want to make sure we consider this as a full-blown experience. Again, from some of these metrics, we have about 5 to 7 different tools that are often being used to run a grant program. And the challenge with that is all those kind of things I just showed you, we completely lose that ability. So applicants can create these profiles, they're interactive, they can save, they can log out, they can receive real-time communication and feedback from you. Maybe you want them to come back and add additional deliverables. Maybe you want them to change something, right? Instead of them having to email it to you, they can just open up their profile again. So again, it kind of consolidates the entire grantee experience in one hub. But then what about you guys? So again, I'm not going to talk much about data security and privacy just because it can be kind of a boring topic. But I do want to kind of just re-emphasize how important this is. These absolutely are life-changing opportunities. And with the magnitude of that, we have to make sure that we're being very sensitive to people's personal identifying information, especially if we're talking about anything tax related or any type of budget related document. So Reviewr is a SOC 2 Type 2 compliant platform. That's kind of the key metric that you have to kind of keep an eye on with whatever tools that you're using. On top of that, we have to make sure that all the tools play well together. So just because you might have a certain tool for your submission process doesn't make you compliant because you're then downloading, exporting, and not using spreadsheets, right? You lose all that compliance once you leave that ecosystem. So it's important for us to kind of realize that these programs aren't just collecting applications and then cutting checks. We have to be monitoring progress. There's communication that's happening constantly in real time. Obviously, you are reviewing information. You are going through judging selection processes. You are logging, grants being funded. It's multi-phase programs. There's reporting that's going on. And we have to kind of, again, operationally think through that entire thing. So if you are not using a platform for any of those elements, or if you have to leave your current infrastructure to do literally any of that, then we have to kind of revisit where we're at in the process. So operationally speaking for you guys, what does that look like? Everything has to start with some type of command dashboard. So you have to be able to physically view in real time, like where are you in the process? How many applicants have you received? Where are they? Are they just starting but not finished? Do you want to send them built-in reminder messages? Or 6 months from now, are they completely done? They have been funded and now they're in their third phase of grant reporting templates. Again, these are entire life cycles. We have to think of it as such. So full visibility on every kind of key component or KPI that goes into your program. What I wanted to show you here, though, is how organized and structured we can make the data management. So again, if you're using like an online forum tool or some type of database, you might think from the front-facing perspective, that's a very modern experience. Applicants are going online, they're filling things out, they're submitting it, and that's very, very true. But we all know what that means then for you guys, right? You're then sifting through databases, you're compiling spreadsheets, you're kind of creating these pivot tables, you're merging of stuff. In Reviewr, we basically give you this menu, and you can sort and filter by virtually any parameters, right? So your types of grants, your phases of grant making, the status of the applicants. You will then get a list, right, of every single grantee that's in your workflow. And from there, you can click on their name. And this is really where the magic happens. Again, not just to preview Reviewr, but the concept behind a profile where there are so many moving parts to a grant making process. To be able to click on a grant applicant's name and be able to visualize literally everything in one hub is absolutely critical. So Michael is a grantee, and I can physically view right off the bat all of Michael's information. So here's his entire full-blown submission / profile that was filled out. This is the content that we just looked at, right? So there's the grant request, there's the project information. If I keep scrolling, we're going to get into things like budgets, we're going to get into things like sustainability, how we define success, all the core components from the application. However, you also remember we collected multiple file uploads. So if I jump up top, obviously within Reviewr, there's some built-in note-taking tools, there's some communication tools. I can physically view every single deliverable or file that was ever added, either initially in the application phase or any ongoing data capture needs that you have from the grantees. So budgets, file uploads, photos, videos, whatever it might be, I can press the view button. And again, that document gets embedded right in Reviewr. So I'm creating these virtual quote unquote binders that contain every activity and all of the data associated with my grantees. Already kind of previewed that for you earlier on, but if you are collecting things like references, you'll see a list of every reference and or the ongoing reporting or data templates that are being submitted by the applicants. So if I press view, again, that entire form shows up here. So just to reiterate, we've kind of left the days of having, disconnected processes in 7 or 8 different platforms. I now view Michael Scott's. I can view all my applicants. I can open one of them up, and within one click, I have who they are, their submission form, their file uploads, communication, the results of the process, plus any ongoing data collection needs, which may be for 5, 6, 7 years down the road, right? All centralized in one hub, which then makes it very accessible for you guys to start to generate reports. Because when you go to run reports, you have all the data connected to one centralized hub. You're not sorting and sifting and trying to find things to kind of build these reports. It's all there ready to go for you. So then the last piece of that puzzle, as we kind of hop around here a little bit, is the review and selection. Again, I use the term experience. There's 3 of them. There's applicant experience, the operation experience, and then the review and selection experience. And again, I think far too often, if I go back to this trend survey here, is that we focus on creating a highly engaging experience for the applicants, or we're trying to create efficiencies for our operation team, and we lose focus on there's 3 parties involved. So from a review and selection perspective, this is where things get quite complex for most organizations. You might have knocked it out of the park collecting applications. You might have a pretty well-oiled machine operationally speaking, right? You've got these databases, you can view the information, you can send communication, but at some point in time, you have to take those grant applicants, send them off to your team for some type of review and selection. And I hope that that review and selection is done very formally using some type of mathematic, quantitative scoring rubric in conjunction with a deliberation / subjective review. So how are you doing these types of things? There has to be a way for you to physically move applicant to your team and tell them to go review it without them having to download, export, or manipulate anything at all. So at its core, we have to first and foremost think through how we want to even share that with them in the first place. One of the studies that we recently saw said that roughly 15 submissions is the threshold for a review committee to evaluate. Seems like a rather small number, but depending on the complexity of your applications, if each one of them is taking them, 10, 15, 20 minutes, we're looking at many, many hours of review. And so if you have 100 submissions, you can't ask a volunteer or a review team to spend 4 or 5 days doing these types of activities. Their energy levels fall off quite dramatically. And then the question then will be posed, how did the first applicant get reviewed in comparison to the 91st applicant? Did they get the same fair opportunity? And I don't think we can confidently say yes. So how do you build this ecosystem and review process where every applicant's being reviewed a fair number of times? We're not overwhelming the review committees. We're also being sensitive to not having personal biases. So there's many ways that you can kind of configure this. I'm going to walk you through this. I think generally speaking, I love using built-in randomization tools. It lowers the barrier for you and your teams, right? With one click, you can just take your submissions, divvy it back out. It also then allows you to set parameters to avoid overwhelming your review team. It also does give you some flexibility to modify that or customize it. If it's a multi-phase program, that also gives you quite a bit of flexibility as well. Many of you might start with an internal vetting and review of applicants, narrow it down to a smaller subset, advance those onto another review, and then do a final board selection for the last group of people. So you can do this in a combination of all of those. The other thing that we have to look at is the redaction of personal identifying information. And basically what my comment on that is this. when your review team comes in to review grant applications, if either A, the data is not relevant to the selection, hide it, redact it, or B, if any of that data can be used to influence them to have a personal bias, hide that as well. So right off the bat, any identifying information of who they are, gone. And then number two is if you're collecting data for just record keeping purposes, just don't show it to the review team. It opens up a door for extra risk that nobody wants to take on. Plus, it just overwhelms your committees who are already, quite frankly, overwhelmed. So before I show that to you, the last thing I want to kind of loop in there is the review and selection, right? One thing we generally want to avoid is having a review committee going off on their own and kind of coming up with their own selections without any type of guidance, right? If you have a 15-person review team, you want every one of those 15 individuals to have some type of guiding principles that they're all working against that are similar to one another. That way, when they go to do a selection, they all had kind of the same kind of thought process and they're looking at every applicant through the same lens or through the same scope. Generally speaking, that's done through scorecards. So some type of higher level rudimentary scorecard is totally fine, where the review team is ranking, they're scoring, they're answering a series of questions, and they're going to leverage real data to help take your applicants and turn it into a leaderboard. And then from there, you can absolutely take those leaderboards and have deliberation meetings and have kind of subjective conversations around them. But we wanted to do our best to leverage math and quantitative scores and data to make better informed decision-making processes off of it. So what does all of that look like? So in Reviewr, at least, everything starts with what I call these review buckets. So again, there's many ways to set this up. If you are an organization that offers multiple grants, it's the easiest way of doing it is you basically have a bucket per grant. Others might offer multiple phases of review. So internal vetting team, phase 2 review, final selection. Others might break this into pods. They might say, hey, let's just break our team into committees of 5. And then each committee is going to be reviewing 10 submissions. Again, there's so many ways to do this. Personally, for me, though, I like to think of buckets as a way to categorize applicants. So you take a bucket and you fill it up with 2 things. One is a list of grantees or applicants. The other is a team of review committee members. So in this case, whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark come into Reviewr, they're physically only going to be reviewing the submissions in their bucket. So it's a way for you to kind of divvy out access levels. So again, if you have a phase 1 team, which is in charge of purely vetting them, they would then come in and only see the vetting applications. You would then take the top X number, move them to phase 2, totally new team comes in and they can only see what you want them to see. So many ways to set this up. Now, from a randomization perspective, though, this is where things get really exciting because I know for a fact that A, every applicant has to be reviewed the same number of times, and B, I don't want my team reviewing more than 15 or 20 submissions. So in that use case, I can actually bulk select all of my applicants, and I can literally type in those parameters. I could say, give every applicant to 5 evaluators. However, I don't want my review team to look at more than 20 people. And then in Reviewr, the system will literally take your submissions equally and randomly automatically distribute it out to your team. So it looks something like this. It would then show me a list of every applicant, who's reviewing it, how many they're being reviewed. And if I edit that, it still does give you complete flexibility to override it. So just because Mark was randomly assigned to Gabrielle, Leslie, and Richard, I can uncheck somebody's name and reassign them back out to somebody else. So if there's a conflict of interest or if one of your committee members just isn't doing their job, you can then kind of easily reassign this back out to other people. So the benefits there is we've taken a large number of applications, we've bifurcated it out to your review team in a much more bite-sized manner, but we did so in a way where there was no human judgment involved, so we didn't have to worry about any personal biases, and it was done in real time automatically with one single click of a button. Now, again, there's a million ways to take your applicants and pair them up with review teams. That's just a couple examples. Now, again, so this is great, but what happens next once the review team goes to actually begin reviewing? So they too get a menu. They will basically see a list of all of the applicants you want them to review. Again, more times than not, this is a volunteer activity, right? Most evaluators for a grant are either board members, they're volunteers, or they have other priorities. You physically can't ask them to go to Google Drive, download all the applicants, then go to a spreadsheet, log their notes, recompile it, and send it back to you. That just is an absolute too much human involvement, too much room for human error, too much time and activity, right? From a volunteer's perspective. And then operationally speaking, then you need to take all of that information back from them and do something with it. You have to recompile it, you have to digest it, you have to run formulas. So in Reviewr, they get this simple menu that shows them, hey, look, here's who you've been assigned to review. They just simply click on them. From here, it gives them a split screen. So again, the idea is to be sensitive. It's going to redact any information from them. So personal information, phone number, whatever it might be. And then off to the right is your selection tool, which is completely customizable. So again, the idea is they can side by side read through the application form, read through the file uploads, look at the supplemental documents, answer a series of questions. Again, those files get embedded, so they can physically look at the file uploads while in Reviewr. They can jump over to those references or those grant reporting templates. And then once they're done, they just submit this. They move on to the next in real time. So we really lowered the barrier for them, but better yet, operationally speaking, you get these leaderboards, and it's going to show you in real time a list of every grantee, who reviewed them, how they individually scored, how they collectively scored, and how they scored as an average. So you can now take this and start to make real informed data decision making off of it. You basically have these built-in real-time leaderboards of every applicant and where they stand amongst their peers. So for you guys, you can either take like the top X number and then advance them to phase 2 or phase 3. You can use this to make your selections, or maybe this is what's going to power a very subjective deliberation. Just because Richard here is our third rated applicant does not mean that he or she is not deserving of a grant. Maybe one of your applicants or one of your review committee members, I should say, wants to make a compelling argument against it or for him. They can do so. Just because this is what the data says does not mean this is how it lives. We're just giving you guys the data that you need to make whatever decisions you want. In fact, just to kind of showcase the power of Reviewr and having a dedicated platform for the use case, you can see that Mark here scored Sheldon a 12. So my first question would be, okay, well, we did random judge distribution, right? That typically implies that not every applicant got reviewed by every committee member. So what happens if Sheldon got assigned to just a very hard judge, just got the short straw? So what if Mark here has never given higher than a 13? So by his own personal standards, he actually scored Sheldon quite high, but in comparison to Judge Judy, he actually scored quite low, and this grantee is now being negatively impacted by that. So we have some pretty cool reports. If I just jump ahead here a little bit, this is a real client. We've redacted all of the data here, but they basically asked the question, why is it that every year, whoever Judge Judy scores never gets funded, but anybody that Tony does? Tony does. Um, and the data is quite obvious, right? Judge Judy on average scores a full 10 points lower than Tony. That can't happen. That's extremely problematic. So now that we know that, we can start to make decisions. And so in this type of reporting functionality, it actually will replace the numbers. So just because Tony gave this person a 24, that's now a 1, which means Tony scored that applicant completely average. So your end all be all results would look a little bit different. It would say, okay, Bruce here is our highest rated applicant because he was scored 1.15 times higher than the overall average, whereas Elon was the lowest rated applicant who scored 0.3 times lower than the collective average. So again, without having like an end-to-end system, we couldn't even A, identify that this is a problem, and then B, take action on it. So this is kind of like a little bonus I wanted to throw in there just to showcase that at least here at Reviewr, we've seen literally everything from a grant making process of how these kind of programs run. And so it's not just us saying, hey, here's some features and tools that we think you might want. It's literally people like yourselves on the front lines. If I go all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, who said something like, let's go here. They said, we want to prioritize our applicant experience. Here's how we want to see it work. And that's what informs the decisions that we have within the system. So again, this is kind of one of those like last minute emergency webinars based off of the findings of this study. We will share this back out. Again, it's obviously targeted towards associations, but A, some of you are associations on this call. And then B, a lot of the things that we see here are relevant to you. It's basically targeting nonprofits and their insights into the utilization of technology and the impact it has on their organization. So with all that said, I'm going to jump back over to Reviewr, or I'm sorry, back over here. And I want to see what kind of questions I can answer from any of you, either in regards to the platform, about your own grant making process, about kind of emerging trends, best practices, questions that you have about your internal processes that you want us to look at. The beauty of my job and what we do here at Reviewr is we have tens of thousands of these conversations every year. And so if I don't have answers for you, I surely can find resources that will. So I want to make sure that I'm accepting myself as a resource, answer whatever questions you might have for me. And what we're going to end up doing as well is we'll send out like a recap of obviously this conversation. We'll also add some of our insights and feedback in a more bite-sizable manner using interactive tours of how to, if I jump ahead one step, how to address some of these items. This was kind of us nitpicking like 4 or 5 key metrics, but there's actually a lot of other items to unpack here. Things like the utilization of AI and kind of how that's a growing concern, which we can kind of address a little bit here at Reviewr. We talked a little bit about like the data security and privacy things, like what to look out for, different types of compliances or frameworks. So yeah, getting pretty quiet. So with that said, I think we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Again, keep an eye out for that follow-up. If there's anything I can ever do for any of you, if you want to kind of dive deeper into your own programs and offer insights and best practices, open to it. If you want to explore more about how, Reviewr could power some of your programs and your grant making, again, just let me know. But just want to make sure that I'm readily available to be a resource to any questions that you guys might have. Thanks so much.